My parents tried to give my company to their golden child, so I walked away and let it burn. Hi, my name is Ryan, and I'm 35 years old. And before anyone says something like, "This sounds like old family baggage," I need to be very clear about one thing up front. This story did not start with a company. It didn't start with money, and it definitely didn't start with revenge. It started with a pattern that existed for as long as I can remember. I grew up in what most people would call a normal household. 2 parents, 2 kids, middle-class neighborhood. No screaming matches, no obvious abuse. From the outside, everything looked fine. Inside, though, there were 2 sets of rules. One for my younger sister, Sarah, and one for me. Sarah is 3 years younger than I am. From the time we were kids, she had a way of bending situations in her favor. She wasn't dumb or helpless. She was smart, emotional, and very good at reading people. If she wanted something, she didn't ask once and accept the answer. She negotiated. She escalated. She made it uncomfortable to say no. My parents didn't call it manipulation. They called it strong personality. I learned early that resistance was pointless. When I was 8, I remember saving allowance money for months to buy a used game console from a friend. I was short by about $20, so I asked my parents if they could help me cover the difference. My dad told me that learning patience was important and that I could wait. 2 weeks later, Sarah threw a tantrum in a toy store because she wanted a doll set. She cried so loudly that my mom got embarrassed. They bought it for her on the spot. When I asked why it was different, my mom said, "She's younger. You're more mature." That sentence would become a theme in my life. Birthdays were another example. My birthdays were practical. Clothes, school supplies, occasionally something I needed but didn't want. Sarah's birthdays were events. Parties, friends, decorations, gifts she'd been talking about for months. I remember one year, maybe I was 13, when my parents forgot my birthday entirely. Not maliciously, they just forgot. We had cake 2 days later. Sarah apologized for reminding them late. That same year, Sarah's birthday party had a rented venue. When I turned 16, I wanted a car. Nothing special, just something that ran. I worked after school and saved money. I asked my parents if they could help me with the last bit so I could buy a cheap used sedan. They said no. They told me that responsibility meant earning things on my own. I bought the car anyway 6 months later with my own money. 2 years after that, Sarah turned 16. She cried about how stressful school was, about how unsafe buses felt, about how everyone else had a car. My parents surprised her with one. It was newer than mine. I remember standing in the driveway watching her hug them, hearing my dad say, "You understand, right?" I nodded. I always nodded. But that was the first time I asked them directly why things were different. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just asked. My mom told me I was being dramatic. My dad said comparisons weren't healthy. Then my mom added, "You've always been more capable. Sarah needs more support." That was the moment I understood something important. Support wasn't about need. It was about who made people feel needed. This followed us into college. I did well in school. I got into a decent state university. Before enrolling, I sat my parents down and asked if they could help with tuition. Even a little. I showed them numbers. I showed them what loans would look like. They told me they couldn't. They said they needed to think about Sarah's future too. So I worked. I took loans. I planned carefully. A few years later, Sarah got into a prestigious business school. Suddenly, money wasn't an issue. There were dinners, celebrations, extended family calls. My parents talked about her education like it was an investment. One night, after too much wine, I asked my dad why it had been different for me. He sighed and said, "You always land on your feet, Ryan." That wasn't a compliment. It was an excuse. By that point, I had already started retreating into something that made sense to me. Computers. When I was 12, my uncle gave me an old desktop he didn't want anymore. It barely worked, but I took it apart anyway. I broke it. Then I fixed it. That process felt fair, honest, predictable. In high school and college, I taught myself to code. I freelanced. I built tools for small businesses. Not glamorous stuff, boring, practical systems. Scheduling, inventory, order tracking, logistics. I listened to the same complaints over and over again. Small companies bleeding time and money because nothing talked to anything else. Big companies had enterprise software. Small ones were stuck patching together spreadsheets and emails. That's where the idea came from. Not some big dream. A solution to a boring problem. I started building a logistics platform that centralized order flow, inventory, scheduling, and fulfillment. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. More importantly, it saved people time. I didn't even call it a company at first. It was just something I refined at night after contract work. Then clients started asking for it. Then they started paying. That's when I realized I needed to do this properly. I went all in after college. I lived cheaply. I worked nonstop. I filed for a patent, not on the code itself, but on the logistical process that made the system efficient and defensible. That patent matters later. To scale, I needed capital. Not a lot, just enough to cover legal fees, early hires, and infrastructure. About $20,000. For the first time in my adult life, I asked my parents for help. I didn't ask for a gift. I asked for a loan. I came prepared. Business plan. Revenue projections. Client interest. Patent paperwork. Repayment schedule. They hesitated. Not because it was risky, but because Sarah wasn't involved. Eventually, they agreed under conditions. The money would be a loan. I would repay it with interest. And in exchange, they wanted 30% of the company. At the time, I told myself this was just business. That it was fair. That it didn't mean anything emotionally. I signed the paperwork. That decision would come back later. But in that moment, all I felt was relief. I finally had resources. And my parents finally had a reason to pay attention. Not to me, but to what I had built. The first few years of the company were not inspiring. They weren't cinematic. They weren't glamorous. They were exhausting, lonely, and humiliating in ways that are hard to explain unless you've lived them. After college, I didn't move into some trendy apartment or co-working space. I rented the cheapest office I could find. A converted storage unit with bad insulation and flickering lights. I brought in an old couch from Craigslist and pushed it against the wall. That couch became my bed. Most nights, I didn't go home. There wasn't much of a point. I'd work until 2 or 3 in the morning, fall asleep for a few hours, then wake up to emails, bugs, or rejection. And there was a lot of rejection. Potential clients told me my product was interesting but risky. Investors told me it was too niche. Others told me I should come back when I was bigger, which was ironic because I needed them to get bigger. I sent hundreds of cold emails. Most were ignored. Some got polite no's. A few got laughed off the phone. I stopped going out. I stopped dating. I stopped answering messages from friends because I didn't have anything to say. My life shrank down to a screen, a keyboard, and the constant pressure of wondering if I was wasting my 20s on something that would never work. There were nights I ate the same thing 3 days in a row because it was cheap and it kept me upright. Ramen, peanut butter sandwiches, whatever didn't require thinking. I kept a toothbrush in the office bathroom and learned how to wash my face in cold water without looking in the mirror too long. Because if I looked too long, I'd start doing math. How old I was, how many hours I'd worked, how little I had to show for it. The office wasn't a startup space. It was an overheated box in summer and a freezing box in winter. The couch smelled like old fabric and energy drinks. I'd wake up with my neck stiff, laptop imprinting faint lines into my skin, and the first thing I'd do was check email, because I was terrified of missing the one message that might finally change everything. When potential clients rejected me, it wasn't just no. It was the kind of no that makes you question your sanity. Call us when you're bigger. We went with a more established vendor. This is interesting, but we can't be your test case. I'd rewrite pitches at 2 in the morning like changing a sentence could change my life. Some weeks I'd have 5 calls and 5 rejections, and I'd still tell myself that was progress because at least people were answering. And while I was living like that, Sarah's life looked like a completely different planet. Every time I opened Instagram to decompress, it was photos of her at a rooftop bar, her in a new outfit, her at a weekend trip, her smiling at some conference with a caption about grinding and hustle culture. It was always framed like she was earning it, like she was pushing through, like she was building something. But I knew where the money came from. I knew because my parents would casually mention it like it was normal. "We helped her with rent this month," my mom would say, "just until her next thing lines up. We covered the trip," my dad would add. "It's a networking opportunity." If I ever reacted, if my face changed in any way, Sarah would look at me and smirk like she'd scored a point. "What?" she'd say. "Jealous." And I'd do what I always did. I'd swallow it, because I didn't have time to fight. I was too busy trying to keep my lights on. During that time, Sarah's life looked very different. She traveled. She went to conferences. She posted pictures from rooftop bars, destination weddings, and weekend getaways. Her Instagram was a highlight reel of success, confidence, and carefully curated happiness. My parents helped fund that life. They paid for her apartment in a good part of town. They helped with trips. They framed everything as networking or investing in her future. I never said anything. I told myself it didn't matter. But every Sunday we had dinner. And every Sunday felt like walking into a performance where I was the punchline. My parents would ask Sarah about her week, her connections, her plans. They listened intently. They nodded. They asked follow-up questions. When they turned to me, it was always the same. "So, still doing that software thing?" Sarah would smile and say things like, "How's your little startup?" If I explained progress, she'd tilt her head and say, "That's cute, but are you actually making money?" If I said I was busy, she'd laugh. "Busy doing what?" "Coding alone in your cave." My parents didn't stop her. Sometimes they laughed along. Sometimes they told her she was just teasing. Those dinners were a special kind of torture because they weren't openly hostile. They were polite, smiling, condescending. My parents would ask Sarah about her future, and the whole table would lean in. When it came to me, it was always framed like a curiosity about a hobby. "So, Ryan," my dad would say, "are you still doing, what is it, logistics software?" And Sarah would jump in before I could even answer. "He's basically building spreadsheets but with extra steps," she'd say, laughing. If I tried to explain the actual product, the automation, the integrations, the process, their eyes would glaze over. But Sarah would still comment because she didn't need to understand it to mock it. "You know what you should do?" she'd say. "You should hire someone who actually knows business." My parents would chuckle like it was a joke, but it always landed like an instruction. And the worst part was I couldn't refuse the invitations. Not really, because at that point the loan was hanging over everything. They didn't even have to say it. I felt it in the way my mom would look at me when I hesitated, like reminding me of a debt without using words. If I pushed back, even lightly, I was told to relax, not take things so seriously. So I stopped responding. I told myself that once the company worked, things would change. Once there was proof. Once there was money. When I finally went to my parents for the $20,000 loan, it wasn't because I wanted their involvement. It was because I was out of options. Legal fees were piling up. Patent filing costs weren't optional. I needed help, and I hated that I needed it from them. When they agreed, I felt relief and something else. Obligation. They never let me forget it. Any disagreement after that was met with subtle reminders. "Well, we did help you get started. After everything we've done, we just want what's best. We're invested in this too." Technically, they weren't wrong. Emotionally, it meant I couldn't say no. So when Sarah started taking an interest, I didn't shut it down the way I should have. I told myself I owed them cooperation. When she asked questions, I answered. When she made suggestions, I listened. When my parents framed her involvement as temporary, I accepted it. Sunday dinners became strategy sessions. Sarah would talk about scaling, about hiring aggressively, about chasing bigger clients. She spoke confidently, like someone who'd never had to worry about payroll. I didn't want to scale. Not yet. Scaling meant risk. It meant burning cash. It meant losing control of the thing I'd built carefully, piece by piece. I wanted steady growth, not explosive growth. When I said that, Sarah smirked. "You're thinking too small," she'd say. "You're afraid to let it become something real." My parents agreed with her. They told me I was playing it safe, that I was limiting potential, that if I didn't move fast, someone else would. They never asked why I was cautious. They never asked what it had cost me to get there. At the office, things changed too. Sarah started stopping by unannounced. She'd chat with employees, ask what they thought, frame conversations like she was gathering feedback for Ryan. People liked her. She was approachable, confident. She spoke their language. I noticed that when I walked into rooms, conversations would pause. Not because they were hiding something, but because the dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the only center of gravity. At home, the jokes continued. At work, the influence spread. And every time I thought about drawing a line, I remembered the paperwork. The loan. The 30%. The fact that saying no would turn into a family war I didn't think I could win. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I worked harder. And I watched. The shift didn't happen all at once. If it had, I might have reacted differently. Instead, it happened the way these things usually do. Slowly, quietly, wrapped in reasonable language. At first, Sarah's involvement was still unofficial. She wasn't on payroll. She didn't have a title. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, everything had. She started attending internal meetings. Not consistently at first, just occasionally, to understand the business better. She'd sit slightly back from the table, listening, nodding, asking questions that sounded thoughtful but were actually directional. Questions like, why are we prioritizing this client over that one? Has anyone considered what this would look like at scale? Is this process still necessary? Or is it just how you've always done it? She never said Ryan is wrong. She didn't have to. After meetings, team members would approach her. I'd overhear fragments of conversation. Phrases like, that's a good point, or I hadn't thought of it that way. And then they'd come to me later, rephrasing her ideas as concerns. At home, my parents began using different language. They stopped asking how the company was doing and started asking where it was going. They framed everything as long-term planning. Legacy. Vision. You don't want to plateau, my dad said once. You don't want to be stuck maintaining instead of leading, my mom added. Sarah, of course, agreed. She talked about market positioning, competitive threats, brand presence. She spoke with confidence, confidence that came from education, not experience. From theory, not consequence. I pushed back carefully. I explained that our strength was stability, that our clients valued reliability, that rapid scaling could break what we'd built. Sarah laughed. Not loudly, not mockingly, just enough to signal that she found my thinking quaint. You're thinking like a technician, she said, not like a leader. My parents nodded. That was the first time I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger exactly, but a sense of being slowly edged out of my own narrative. Things escalated when Sarah asked to be more formally involved. She framed it as necessity. If I'm contributing this much, it makes sense to define my role, she said. My parents agreed immediately. They suggested a title, Chief Operating Officer. I almost laughed. The company had fewer than 20 employees. I said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, just no. That's when the tone changed. My parents reminded me again that they owned 30%, that they had a stake, that they were thinking about the future. Sarah accused me of being insecure. I'm trying to help you, she said, but you don't seem to trust anyone. I trusted plenty of people. I didn't trust her. The argument didn't explode. It stalled. Everyone agreed to revisit it later. But from that point on, Sarah started acting as if the title was inevitable. She began sending emails on behalf of leadership. She scheduled meetings without looping me in. She spoke to vendors using we instead of Ryan's company. And slowly people followed her lead. Not because she was evil. Not because they were disloyal. Because power once implied tends to solidify. The real turning point came during a quarterly review. My parents wanted an update, formal one. They asked me to prepare a presentation. Revenue, growth, projections. I did. Halfway through, Sarah interrupted. She pulled up her own deck. I hadn't seen it before. She talked about restructuring, about hiring aggressively, about repositioning the company for acquisition or outside investment. She talked like someone already in charge. When I tried to respond, my dad stopped me. Let her finish. That moment stays with me, not because it was dramatic, but because it was clear. My voice no longer carried default authority. After the meeting, my parents sat me down. They said they were concerned, that I was too close to the product, that I lacked the objectivity needed to lead the company into its next phase. They said Sarah had the right background, the right instincts. They said something that finally crystallized everything. This company is bigger than you now. That sentence did something to me, because I realized they believed it. They believed that once something became valuable, it stopped belonging to the person who built it. They proposed a transition plan. Sarah would step into a formal leadership role. I would focus on innovation. Decisions would be made collaboratively with their oversight. I asked a simple question. What happens if I say no? My mom looked uncomfortable. My dad didn't. He said, then we'd have to consider other options. He didn't explain what those options were. He didn't need to. I went home that night and didn't sleep. I replayed every conversation, every document, every assumption I'd made. I realized something important. They weren't trying to steal the company. They genuinely believed they were entitled to it. Because they'd helped. Because they were family. Because they'd decided Sarah deserved it more. The next few weeks were unbearable. Sarah acted like the decision had already been made. She spoke openly about future plans. She corrected me in meetings. She reassured employees that change can be uncomfortable, but necessary. My parents backed her at every turn. If I objected, I was told I was emotional, resistant, afraid. And maybe I was afraid, not of losing money, but of losing the one thing in my life that had ever been mine. I started withdrawing, not emotionally, strategically. I stopped arguing. I stopped correcting. I stopped explaining. Instead, I watched. I reviewed contracts. I reread the patent filings. I looked closely at who owned what and how things were structured. I noticed details I'd glossed over before, where assets were held, how client relationships were defined, which agreements were tied to me personally. I didn't feel clever. I felt calm. For the first time since Sarah entered the picture, I felt like I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Because one thing was clear now. They weren't asking me to step aside. They were telling me. And when people tell you who they think you are in their story, you have two choices. Accept the role, or write a different ending. After that quarterly meeting, something subtle but unmistakable changed. People stopped asking me questions. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough that I noticed. Decisions were discussed before I arrived. Conversations happened offline. I'd hear about things after the fact, framed as updates instead of discussions. Sarah had mastered the art of pre-alignment. She'd talk to my parents first, then to one or two influential team members. By the time something reached me, it was already positioned as the consensus. If I pushed back, I wasn't disagreeing with her anymore. I was disagreeing with everyone. At home, the dynamic hardened. Sunday dinners, which had always been uncomfortable, became unbearable. Sarah stopped pretending to respect my role. She'd make jokes openly now. So Ryan, she'd say, smiling sweetly, are you still afraid of growth? Or have you finally come around? My parents laughed. Not nervously, not awkwardly, like it was harmless teasing. If I responded calmly, explaining my reasoning, she'd roll her eyes. See? This is what I mean. Everything has to be overthought. You're too attached. My dad would chime in. She's not wrong. You do get defensive. I wasn't defensive. I was being overridden. But I learned very quickly that pointing that out only made things worse. The narrative had already shifted. Sarah was the visionary. I was the obstacle. My parents started using language that made my skin crawl. They talked about risk mitigation, about protecting the company from stagnation, about balancing emotion with business. Anytime I expressed discomfort, it was framed as proof of my unsuitability to lead. One night after dinner, my mom pulled me aside. She said she was worried about me. "You seem tense," she said, "like you're afraid of losing control." That word, control, stuck, because it wasn't about control. It was about ownership. But the more I tried to explain that, the more I sounded exactly like what they were accusing me of being. So I stopped explaining. At work, Sarah's influence deepened. She began setting agendas. She reframed roadmaps. She positioned herself as the person translating my technical thinking into real business strategy. Employees adapted quickly, not out of malice, out of self-preservation. People follow perceived power. And Sarah was being positioned as inevitable. I noticed that new hires were being introduced to her first, that external partners started copying her on emails instead of me, that my name was slowly being removed from conversations I'd started. I confronted her once. Privately, I told her she was overstepping, that she was undermining me, that this wasn't what I'd agreed to. She didn't deny it. She smiled and said, "Ryan, you're exhausted. You've been carrying this thing alone for years. Let someone else take some weight." I asked her directly if she was trying to replace me. She laughed. "Replace you? No, that's dramatic." Then she added casually, "But the company needs leadership that can grow beyond its creator." That was the first time she said it out loud. Creator, past tense. After that, my parents stopped pretending neutrality. They stopped saying things like, "We just want to help." They started saying things like, "This is what's best for the company." And every time I resisted, the loan came up. Never directly, never explicitly, but always hovering. "You wouldn't even be here without us. We took a risk on you. We believed in you when no one else did." That last one hurt the most, because it wasn't true. They believed in the asset, not the person. I thought about walking away more than once, just quitting, letting them have it, starting over. But every time I came close, I imagined Sarah standing at the head of the company, talking about her vision, her leadership, her success, built on years of my work. I couldn't do it, not because of ego, but because surrender felt like confirming everything they'd ever believed about me, that I was temporary, replaceable, useful only until something better came along. So I stayed, and I watched. I started noticing how fragile their confidence really was, how much they relied on appearances, on titles, on assumptions. They assumed the company existed independently of me. They assumed relationships were transferable, that loyalty could be reassigned, that process mattered more than people. Those assumptions would matter later. For now, I let them believe I was beaten down. I stopped challenging Sarah publicly. I deferred in meetings. I nodded when my parents talked about transition plans. They mistook my silence for acceptance. They mistook exhaustion for surrender. They mistook patience for weakness. And once people make that mistake, they stop watching you closely, which is exactly when it becomes possible to move. I didn't wake up one morning with a master plan. There was no dramatic turning point, no final insult that pushed me over the edge. What happened instead was much simpler. I stopped trying to convince people who had already decided who I was, and I started paying attention to details I'd ignored before. For years, I had been so focused on building the product and keeping the company alive that I treated the business structure as background noise, something necessary but secondary. Now, it was the only thing that mattered. I went back to the beginning. Every document, every contract, every email thread from the early days. I reread the loan agreement my parents and I had signed. I read it slowly, without emotion, line by line, not looking for loopholes, just understanding exactly what it said and what it didn't. The money they gave me had bought them equity, but not control. They owned 30% of the company. They did not own the intellectual property. They did not own client relationships. They did not own me. The patent was in my name. Not the company's. Not theirs. Mine. At the time, that had seemed like a technical detail. Now it was everything. I spoke to a lawyer. Not dramatically. Not urgently. Just carefully. I framed it as a hypothetical. I asked what would happen if a founder with majority ownership and IP rights chose to leave a company where minority stakeholders wanted to replace him. The lawyer asked good questions. Who owned the IP? Who signed the client contracts? Who employed the staff? With every answer, his expression changed slightly. By the end of the meeting, he said something that stuck with me. "You're not trapped," he said. "You're just assuming you are." That assumption had kept me quiet. It had kept me compliant. And it had allowed Sarah and my parents to believe they were already in charge. I didn't correct that belief. Instead, I made a list. Clients, employees, vendors, infrastructure, processes. I looked at who depended on what and who depended on me. Most of the company's key relationships weren't contractual in the way Sarah assumed they were. They were personal, built over years, maintained through trust and consistency. People didn't stay because of branding. They stayed because things worked, because problems were solved quickly, because promises were kept, because I was there. I started having quiet conversations, not recruitment pitches, not ultimatums, just honesty. I told key team members that I was considering leaving, that there were disagreements about the company's direction, that I wanted to know where they stood, not today, but if things changed. I didn't pressure anyone. I didn't criticize Sarah. I just listened, and people talked. They told me things they hadn't felt comfortable saying before, about confusion, about mixed signals, about decisions that felt rushed or poorly thought out. More than one person said some version of the same sentence. "I thought you were okay with all this." I told them the truth. I wasn't. I began laying groundwork. Quietly, legally, cleanly. I registered a new company. No announcement. No branding push. Just paperwork. I set up new infrastructure. Servers. Tools. Systems. I began preparing a version of the product that didn't rely on shared resources, that used the patented process I owned outright. At the same time, I continued showing up. The groundwork phase was the strangest part because I was doing 2 full-time jobs at once. Running the company in public and quietly building an exit in private. During the day, I played the part they wanted. I attended meetings. I answered questions. I let Sarah talk about vision and expansion. I nodded when my parents acted like they were on the verge of formalizing the structure. At night, I built. I didn't just register a new entity and call it a day. I rebuilt the operational spine, cleanly from scratch, so that nothing depended on the old company's accounts, tools, or access. I separated what was truly mine from what was shared, and I did it in a way that would survive scrutiny. The patent wasn't just paperwork. It was the logic at the core of the product, the workflow, the sequence, the method. And because it was in my name, I could legally build a new product that implemented that method without asking anyone's permission. So I did. I started with a minimal version that could service our key clients without disruption. I wrote documentation like someone was going to read it in court because someone might. Every feature was tracked. Every decision was recorded. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd finally learned that family was not a substitute for proof. Then came the conversations with clients. These weren't cold transfers. These were relationships I'd built one late night at a time. The kind of clients who had my personal number because the product mattered to their business and they trusted me to fix problems fast. I didn't walk in and say, "Come with me." I said something like, "I need you to know there may be changes soon. I'm committed to continuity. If leadership shifts in ways that affect support or reliability, you'll have options." Some clients asked directly if Sarah would be running things. Some asked if I was leaving. Most asked a simpler question: will it still work? That question told me everything. They didn't care about titles. They cared about outcomes. I had similar conversations with the core team. I told them I didn't want anyone to feel trapped, that I wasn't asking for loyalty, I was offering clarity. If the company changed in ways they didn't agree with, they could choose stability instead of chaos. A few people hesitated. They had families, mortgages. They were afraid of taking a leap. I understood that. So I built the new company like it had to be real on day one. Not a dream, not a gamble. Real contracts, real onboarding, real payroll, real timelines. Meanwhile, Sarah was accelerating her timeline because she believed I was collapsing. She started speaking about the transition like it was scheduled. She started drafting org charts with my name pushed into a box labeled product. My parents started using phrases like, "When this is official." And the more confident they became, the less carefully they watched me. That was the opening. I picked a day when the calendar was full, when Sarah and my parents were busy planning their announcement, and I requested a short all-hands meeting. No drama, no warning, just a simple invite. When everyone gathered, I kept it calm. I thanked them for the work they'd done, for the nights they'd put in, for building something solid. Then I told them the truth. I was resigning from the old company, effective immediately, and I was launching a new one. I explained simply that the intellectual property and the core methodology were mine, and that anyone who wanted to continue working with me could. Anyone who wanted to stay could. No pressure, no threats. Sarah's face went blank. My parents looked like I'd slapped them. And the room, this is what I remember most. The room didn't explode. It didn't cheer. It just got very quiet, like everyone was recalculating what they'd assumed was true. After the meeting, people came to me one by one. Not to celebrate, to ask practical questions. Is payroll secure? Are the clients real? Are we protected legally? Those questions were the difference between fantasy and reality. And I had answers. That's when I knew I'd done the groundwork correctly. I nodded in meetings. I agreed to timelines. I let Sarah talk. She mistook my cooperation for surrender. My parents mistook my calm for acceptance. They began accelerating. They scheduled meetings without me. They talked openly about post-transition structure. They discussed leadership announcements. One night, my dad called me. He told me they wanted to make things official. Sarah would step into a formal leadership role. I would move into a technical advisory position. They framed it as a win-win. I told him I needed time to think. He agreed. He didn't sound worried. They thought they had leverage. I spent the next few weeks finishing preparations. I finalized contracts with key clients, contracts that followed me, not the company. I made sure everything was documented, ethical, and above board. When the moment came, there was no shouting, no confrontation, no dramatic reveal. I scheduled a meeting. I thanked everyone for their time. And then I resigned. I told them I was leaving to start a new company, that I was taking the intellectual property I owned, and that clients and employees were free to choose where they wanted to go. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise my voice. Sarah stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. My parents were furious. They accused me of betrayal, of manipulation, of ingratitude. I listened. Then I stood up. I left. The fallout came later. Clients followed me. Employees followed me. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the old company struggled to function. Enough that Sarah's confidence cracked. Enough that my parents realized, too late, that ownership on paper doesn't mean much if you don't own the thing that actually makes the business work. My new company grew faster than the old one ever had. Without family dinners. Without passive-aggressive comments. Without needing permission to exist. For the first time in my life, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph. Relief. That night, I went home and slept in my own bed like a person again. No laptop on my chest. No phone buzzing on the pillow. I woke up the next morning and, for a few seconds, forgot to brace myself. Then I remembered, and instead of dread, I felt something almost unfamiliar. Quiet. Not happiness. Not peace. Just the absence of their noise. The lawsuit didn't come as a surprise. What surprised me was how fast it escalated. Within weeks of my resignation, my new company was served with papers. My parents were suing me for poaching clients, stealing employees, and sabotaging the business I had abandoned. The language was aggressive, emotional, personal. They weren't just trying to win. They were trying to punish me. At the same time, Sarah filed a separate complaint accusing me of misappropriating proprietary systems. Systems I had designed, patented, and documented years before she ever stepped into a meeting. So I responded. I sued them back. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. I filed for an injunction preventing them from using the logistics process covered under my patent. I included timelines, documentation, original code histories, and sworn statements from developers who had worked with me from the beginning. The legal battle became immediate and exhausting. My lawyer was calm about it. Almost too calm. They don't have a strong case, he told me. But they don't need one. That was when I learned what lawfare really looks like. They weren't trying to prove anything. They were trying to bury me. Endless filings. Requests for documentation they already had. Motions that went nowhere but still required responses. Every piece of paper cost money. Every delay was intentional. The goal was simple: run me out of cash. At the same time, they started something else. A narrative. My parents began telling extended family and mutual contacts that they were worried about me, that I'd been acting erratically, that I was isolating myself. That stress had changed me. They didn't accuse me directly. They implied. Aunts and uncles started calling. Not to accuse, to check in. Your mom says you don't seem like yourself. She's worried you're spiraling. Are you okay? I realized what they were doing. They weren't just fighting me legally. They were attacking my credibility. If I could be framed as unstable, everything else would sound plausible. Clients might hesitate. Employees might doubt. Judges might wonder. My lawyer warned me. They're laying groundwork, he said. Stay clean. Stay boring. Let them talk. So I did. I stopped responding emotionally. I documented everything. I showed up to every hearing composed and prepared. But that doesn't mean I didn't feel it. One of the first times I saw the smear campaign collide with reality was during depositions. We were sitting across a conference table in a windowless room that smelled like stale coffee. Lawyers in suits. A court reporter typing every word. The whole thing felt clinical, like a procedure. And then my parents walked in. I almost didn't recognize them. They looked older than they had a month before. My mom's eyes had dark bags underneath them, like she hadn't slept in days. My dad's face was tight in that way people get when they're living on adrenaline. For a second, I felt something close to pity. Then I remembered the phone calls, the whispers, the relatives checking on me like I was unstable, the emails designed to drain my cash. So when they sat down, I looked at them and asked, very calmly, "Have you two been sleeping okay?" No one answered. Not them. Not their attorney. Just the faint tapping of the court reporter. I nodded once, like I'd gotten my answer. I guess betraying your son finally started costing them sleep. After that, the depositions continued, and their strategy became obvious. They weren't trying to establish truth. They were trying to provoke me into sounding reactive, emotional, unstable. Every question was phrased like a trap. Would you say you have a history of conflict with your sister? Would you agree you've been under extreme stress? Have you ever made decisions impulsively when upset? My lawyer objected when he needed to, but the goal wasn't the answers. It was the exhaustion, the grind, the cost. The pressure was constant. The nights were sleepless. Every email felt like another drain on my energy and bank account. That's when I started digging. Not emotionally, financially. I reviewed public records, filings, mortgages, and I found something that stopped me cold. My parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house. They'd put the money into the old company. They weren't just defending it. They were gambling everything on it. The house, their retirement, all of it. They truly believed the business would survive me, that I was replaceable. That discovery didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sick, because it meant there was no graceful exit for them anymore. Either they won, or they lost everything. The stress got to me in ways I'm not proud of. I didn't lash out publicly. I didn't sabotage anything that mattered. But I did small things. Petty things. Harmless on paper. Infuriating in practice. Things that let off pressure. Things that reminded me I wasn't completely powerless. I'm not proud of everything I did during that period. I didn't hurt anyone. I didn't touch the business. I didn't do anything that would have helped me legally. But I was past angry. I was exhausted, cornered, and being slowly crushed under paperwork, whispers, and phone calls asking if I was okay. So yeah, I did petty things. Childish things. Things that didn't matter. Years earlier, when my parents renovated their house, I'd helped them set up a bunch of smart systems. Climate controls. Security. Convenient stuff they barely understood but liked having. Late at night, when I couldn't sleep and my brain was on fire, I'd mess with it. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. The house would get unbearably cold in the middle of the night. An alarm would go off at 4 in the morning for no reason. Lights would turn on when no one was there. It didn't prove anything. It didn't change the lawsuit. It didn't win me a single advantage. But after weeks of being, that's not how software works. Not when the system has real clients depending on it every day. You can't just swap out a core process without breaking 100 small assumptions you forgot were even there. Clients felt it immediately. Support responses slowed because the people who understood the product had already left. Fixes took longer because the workarounds were guesses instead of knowledge. The replacement features rolled out half-finished, and every half-finished feature created new problems. Sarah tried to manage the optics. She emailed clients long explanations about exciting changes and new leadership. She blamed the disruption on legacy architecture. She hinted that I had left things messy. But the clients didn't care about internal politics. They cared about their warehouses, their deliveries, their orders, their payroll. When something didn't work, they didn't want a paragraph. They wanted a fix, and they weren't getting it. The funniest part, if you can call it that, was watching my parents try to be executives. They showed up to meetings they didn't understand, asking questions that sounded important but meant nothing. They talked about protecting the asset while ignoring the fact that the asset was people and relationships, not a logo on a slide. At one point, I heard through a former colleague that my dad suggested hiring a big-name consultant to restore confidence. The consultant was expensive. They hired him anyway. It didn't help, because no consultant can rebuild trust when the people who built the trust are gone. Meanwhile, the mortgage money disappeared into the same hole the lawsuits were digging. Legal fees, emergency hires, rush development, retention bonuses to keep the remaining staff from walking out the door. It turned the company into a machine that burned cash. And when a company burns cash, it starts making choices that look desperate even if no one says the word. They pushed sales harder, promised features they didn't have, took on clients they couldn't support. Sarah thought volume would fix everything. It only accelerated the collapse. By the time the judge issued the order, they weren't just wounded. They were already bleeding out. The ruling didn't kill them by itself. It just removed the last illusion they were surviving on. Time they didn't have. Clients left. Revenue collapsed. Within months, the old company folded. My parents lost the house. They moved into a small apartment together. Sarah tried to find work in the same industry. She couldn't. People talk. They don't need to be warned. They just remember. Today, things are quiet. Too quiet sometimes. I'm still working. Still building. Still careful. I don't feel victorious. I feel done. They tried to erase me. They tried to rewrite me. They tried to break me with paperwork and whispers. They failed. And that's enough. After the ruling, people asked me if it felt good. If I felt vindicated. If I felt like I'd won. I didn't have a satisfying answer for them, because what I felt wasn't victory. It wasn't closure. It was a kind of quiet emptiness, like a room after everyone leaves. The business survived. Mine did. It grew. Paid people. It ran cleanly. Clients got what they needed. The system worked. But family doesn't collapse with a dramatic sound. It just stops existing in the places you expect it to. No Sunday dinners. No holiday texts. No apologies that mean anything. Sometimes I'd see Sarah in a tagged photo from someone else's account, always carefully framed. always smiling like nothing had happened. Then the tags stopped. The mentions stopped. Like the whole chapter had been deleted. I didn't chase them. I didn't try to repair it. I realized something I'd never fully admitted before. I didn't miss them as people. I missed the idea that they might someday become the family I kept hoping for. That hope died in court paperwork and depositions and lies. And once it died, it didn't hurt the way I expected. It just left. That's the part no one warns you about. Sometimes the hardest part wasn't what they lost. It was realizing I could walk past the ruins of what used to be family and feel nothing but distance. And in a strange way, that numbness was the cleanest ending I was ever going to get.